I still have the scar on my left palm, where the rope burned through when I took it from Decker's hand. People ask me sometimes. People who weren't there. People who heard pieces of it and got half of them wrong. They ask what made me do what I did that morning. Like there was a calculation. Like I stood out there in the gray before sunrise and weighed something in my head and arrived at a number. There wasn't any calculation. There was a rope. There was a girl at the end of it. Great. And there was the kind of quiet that settles in a man when he's already decided something, when his body has gotten ahead of his thinking and his hands are already moving. That quiet is the only answer I can give. It wasn't courage. Courage means you're afraid and you do it anyway. I wasn't afraid of Decker. I'd been afraid of nothing since my wife went into the ground, and that was 11 years before that morning. My name is Chayton. Most of the white men in that part of Wyoming called me something shorter and easier on their tongues, but my name is Chayton. It means falcon in my language. My father gave it to me because falcons hunt alone and hit once, and hit clean. He thought that was a good name for a son. Shh. I was 38 years old the morning. I took that rope. I had been chief of my band for 9 years. I had 41 people depending on me for food, for safety, for the kind of steady presence that means a man is still standing when the wind comes. I had not done anything reckless in a long time. I had learned that the cost of reckless falls on other people. I want to tell this right. I want to tell it the way it was, not the way it got told later in Garner's Crossing and Fort Laramie, and eventually all the way down to Cheyenne. The story got cleaned up when it traveled, made simpler, made into something people could hang a hat on. Truth is, messier and quieter and goes back further than that morning. Go back 3 weeks. That's where the thread starts. We were moving camp. End of August. The grass on the eastern flat was going yellow, and we needed the creek water the summer camp didn't have. I rode ahead of the main group to look at the crossing. There's a place where the creek bends, and the bank on the near side is soft in late summer, and you can lose a horse in it if you don't know. I'd crossed it 40 times, but I still looked every time. A chief who stops looking gets people hurt. I came around the cottonwood stand, and there was a wagon sitting at an angle on the far bank. One rear wheel in the water, the tongue dropped. A woman maybe 50 years old was sitting on a stone watching it. Not working on it, waving for help. Just sitting and watching it like it was somebody else's problem. Beside her, on the ground, with her knees pulled up and her back against the wheel that was still on dry land, was a younger woman. Maybe 20. She had dark hair, and her face was turned away from me. She was holding something in her lap. I couldn't see what. I came across. The water was mid-hock on my horse. No problem. I looked at the wheel. The axle wasn't cracked. The wheel had come off its pin, that was all. A half-hour's work with the right tools and a second set of hands. The older woman looked at me the way white women sometimes looked at me. Not afraid exactly. More like I was whether she was deciding how to feel about. I said I could help with the wheel. I said it in English. Shh. My English was better than most white men expected, and that usually made them uncomfortable in a different way, like I'd broken a rule. The older woman said they'd be fine. She said it flat without thank you at the ends. The younger woman turned her head. That was the first time I saw her face. I'm not going to describe it the way men describe women's faces when they're telling stories like this. I'll say what I actually noticed. She had a bruise under her left eye, yellowing 3 or 4 days old. Her hands, the ones holding the thing in her lap, which I could see now was a small tin box, the kind women kept letters in. Her hands had been worked hard. There were calluses on her palms that you don't get from gentle living, and her eyes, when they looked at me, were not afraid. They were watching me the way a person watches something they haven't decided about yet. The older woman said again, they'd be fine. I helped with the wheel anyway. I got down, found a flat rock, used it as a lever while they steadied the tongue. I took maybe 20 minutes. The younger woman held the tongue and didn't drop it. She was stronger than she looked, and she didn't make a sound when the leverage slipped once, and The corner of the wagon came down hard. When it was done, the older woman said nothing. The younger one said quietly, without looking at her mother, "Because I understood by then that was the relation," she said. "Thank you." I rode on. I looked back once from the cottonwood stand. The younger woman was still watching me. The tin box was still in her hands. Don't know why I looked back. I told myself it was habit, that a man on his own land looks back at strangers until they've moved on. That was part of it. But it wasn't all of it, and I knew it wasn't all of it, and I put the knowing away in the place where I put things I didn't need. The older woman's name was Cora Phelps. I found that out later. Daughter's name was Nessa, short for Vanessa, though the girl never used the long version, never called herself that. She'd been Nessa her whole life. The tin box had been her father's. He'd been dead 4 years. In it were 2 letters he'd written her. She'd read them so many times she knew them by heart and still read them. And a photograph and a small piece of mica that caught light and that he'd found on a riverbank when she was and given to her, because she'd said it looked like something magic. It wasn't magic. It was a rock. But he kept it, and she kept it, and she had been carrying that tin box since the morning he died. I learned all of this much later. I tell it here because it matters. Because knowing what a person carries is the only real way to know them. I didn't see her again for 10 days. Then one of my men, Lakota, who went into Garner's Crossing for supplies every 2 weeks, came back and told me there was talk in town. "Talk about a woman," he said. A man named Decker had been drinking at the Broken Spur and saying things. Decker was not from the valley. He'd shown up 6 weeks before, him and 2 others, and they did the kind of work men do when they have no particular skill and no particular scruple. Hauling, guarding, breaking things that needed breaking. The sheriff, such as he was, had looked at them and decided not to look too hard. Coda said. Decker had been saying a woman out on the Phelps place was available, that her mother had worked out a price, that the arrangement would be completed at first light 5 days from then, on the Tuesday. I sat with that for a while. It was not my business. Shh, that was the first thing I said to myself. White men and white women and their arrangements. A chief who reaches into that comes back with burns, free time, and the burns don't fall only on him. I had 41 people. I had my daughter, who was 7 years old, and who was the only thing in the world that could still make me laugh. I had obligations. I sat with it for another day. I thought about the bruise, 4 days old by then, when I'd seen it. I thought about the hands. The 4th night I went to see my elder, an old man named Swiftbird, who had known my father, and who had a way of listening to a problem until the problem answered itself. I told him what Lakota had told me. I told him I was considering going. He smoked for a while. Then he said, "You've already decided." I said I hadn't. He said, "Then why are you dressed for riding?" I looked down. I dressed for riding without noticing. That quiet had come. My body had gotten ahead of my thinking again. Swiftbird said, "Go before you talk yourself out of it, and carry the weight of not going for the rest of your life." I rode out before dawn. The Phelps place was a half-day east. I knew the land out there. We'd wintered near it twice. Years back, when the arrangement between my band and the Valley's white sellers was newer and more careful on both sides. Small house, a barn in worse shape than the house. A windmill that didn't turn. Land that a man might work into something in 10 years, but that Cora Phelps had been letting go to pieces since her husband died. I got there in the dark, and I waited on the rise above the house. I tied my horse to a jack pine that was the only tree for a mile, and I crouched in the grass, and I waited. They came at first light, the way Lakota had said. Decker and one of the others, a thin man with a reddish beard I didn't know the name of. Decker was maybe 40, big through the chest. The kind of man who'd been handsome once, and knew it, and had run the knowledge to ruin. They came on horses from the south, and they came easy, the way men come to a place where they think the business will be smooth. Cora Phelps came out of the house before they'd even stopped. I watched them talk. Couldn't hear it at that distance, but I could read the shapes of it. Money changed hands. I saw the glint of coin. Then Cora turned and went back to the house. She came out with Nessa. Nessa had the tin box in her hands. She was dressed like she'd dressed in a hurry, or like someone had told her what to put on. She was not struggling. She walked steady, but I could see from where I was the way her hands were holding that box tight. Both hands, like it was the only thing she had. Decker got down from his horse and he had a rope. A lead rope, not a throw rope, and he started toward her. That was when I came off the rise. I came down at a gallop and I came quiet. My horse had good hooves, and the ground was soft with the night damp, and I was 50 yards out before. Decker heard me. He turned, and he had time to look startled, and then I was there. I put my horse between him and the girl. He looked up at me. He had small eyes. Men with small eyes have generally talked themselves into things. He said, "This is private business and I'd advise you to ride on." I said, "Drop the rope." He didn't drop it. He looked at the man with the reddish beard. Some kind of signal passed between them. Reddish-bearded man moved his horse to the left, trying to flank. I'd brought my rifle. I had it across my lap, and I brought it up without drama, and I pointed it at Decker's chest, and I said, in the same voice I'd used before, no louder, "Drop the rope and tell your man to stop moving." There's a tone a man can use when he means a thing completely. I had been using that tone for 38 years, and it had never failed me in a direct face. It didn't fail me then either. Decker dropped the rope. I got down from my horse. I kept the rifle where it was, in my right hand, and I picked up the rope with my left. That's where the burn came from. Speed of pulling a rope from gravel. It was nothing. A small burn. It healed in a week. And I put the rope behind me. Then I looked at Nessa. She was looking at me. Same as the first time. Not afraid. Deciding. I said, "I'm going to take you away from here. You don't have to come. You can stay. But I'm giving you the choice your mother didn't give you." She looked at her mother. Cora was standing at the door of the house. Cora didn't say a word. Didn't call her back. Didn't say don't go. That was her answer. Or it was the absence of one, which comes to the same thing. Nessa walked toward me. She walked past Decker and the reddish-bearded man like they were posts in the ground. She walked up to my horse. She looked at me. She said, "Can I keep the box?" I said, "It's yours." She put her foot in the stirrup and I helped her up, and I got up behind her and I turned the horse north. Decker said, from behind us, that this wasn't over, that he'd go to the law. That a half-breed chief stealing a white girl was not something the territory was going to allow. I didn't turn around, I said, loud enough. She walked to me. "There are 2 witnesses," by which I meant him and the reddish-bearded man. They'd watched her walk to me. That would settle them. Men like Decker know which stories they can tell without getting caught in them. We rode. She didn't speak for the first hour. I let that be. The land opened up as we went north and west, the flat turning to broken country with low hills and dry creek cuts. And my horse moved easy. She sat in front of me and held the tin box and looked at the country going past and said nothing. I thought about where to take her. Not to our camp, not yet. There was a place I knew, a dry-walled shelter built against a shelf of sandstone where the south-facing rocks held warmth from the day. I'd used it in winter, alone, more times than I could count. It had water from a seep and a flat floor, and nobody went there because there was things there worth going to. I turned us toward it, she said, around the second hour. They'd been planning it for 6 weeks. I didn't ask her to say more. She would, or she wouldn't, she said. He came out to the house and looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying. I thought she'd throw him out. She made him coffee. I let that land without comment, she said. My father would have burned the house down before he'd let that happen, I said. I know. She turned her head a little, not enough to look at me straight, and said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because of the box." She turned forward again, and she held the box a little tighter. We rode another 10 minutes in quiet, and then she said, almost to herself, "Yes, the shelter was as I'd left it last winter." A few stacked stones I'd added to the west-facing side to break the wind. A ring of old firestones. Some dry wood I'd left under a rock overhang. I got down and helped her down, and she stood and looked at the place, and I could see her taking in the care of it, the small signs of a man who came here alone and arranged things carefully. I built a fire, small, hot, efficient. She watched me do it. I had food in my saddlebag, dried meat, a hard bread my daughter had made the week before, a small folded paper of salt. I laid it out. She ate. So did I. We ate without talking for a while, and then she said, "What happens now?" I said that depended on her. I said she could come to our camp and stay until she decided where she wanted to go. I said I knew people in Laramie, white people. A woman who ran a boarding house, who had taken in women in hard circumstances before. I said I could write a letter and send it ahead of her. She looked at the fire. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire had burned down to orange, and the skies above the sandstone shelf had gone full dark before she said anything else. She said, "You didn't have to come." I said, "No," she said. "So why?" I thought about what Swiftbird had said, about being already decided. I thought about the rope and the quiet, and my hands moving before my thinking. "Did," I said. "I saw your face and I saw your hands, and I knew something about you that I needed to know before I could do nothing." She looked at me then, not the sideways but deciding look. "Straight," she said. "What did you know?" I said. "That you weren't broken. That whatever had happened to you hadn't broken you. And a person like that shouldn't be handed to a man like Decker. That's not a world I can live in and do nothing." She looked at me a long time. Then she looked at the fire. She said, "My husband used to say something like that." I said. "You were married?" she said. "For 2 years. He died of fever the same winter as my father." She stopped. Then, "I had nobody after that. Nobody but her. I didn't say anything about her mother. Nothing useful lives in that conversation." She opened the tin box. She took out the piece of mica and held it so the firelight caught it. It threw small bright points on the sandstone wall. She said, "He found this the summer I was 6. I was mad because I had to come on the walk with him instead of staying home with the chickens." She almost smiled. "I was very attached to the chickens. He found this in the creek bed and held it up and said, 'Look, Nessa, magic.' And I believed him for about 2 years before I figured out it was just a rock." I said, "Does knowing that make it less?" She looked at it. She said, "No, no it doesn't." She put it back. She closed the box. She said, "My name is Nissa." I said, "I know. I'm Chaitan." She said, "I know." She slept that night against the shelter wall, wrapped in the blanket from my saddlebag, the tin box beside her head. I sat up for a while. I told myself I was keeping watch, which was partly true. Partly I was just sitting with the strange weight of having someone else in that shelter. I had been alone in that shelter more than 100 times. The weight of being alone in a place is something you stop noticing. It takes someone else arriving to show you the shape of what was there. I woke her before dawn. I wanted to be away from that part of the country before the day came. We rode west and north. She rode behind me now. She held the cantle with one hand and the tin box with the other, and I could feel her balance shifting with the horse. Easy. Practiced. She'd ridden before. She knew horses. I noticed that the way I notice things about people. A detail that tells you something. I said, "You rode a lot." "Growing up," she said, "we had a ranch until I was 12. Then we lost it and came east. But I never stopped knowing how." I said, "It shows." She said, "Shh," and I could hear in her voice that it meant something to her. That small thing. That being seen for a competence. "My husband said I rode better than him." She paused. "He was a fair rider, so it was a real compliment." We rode. We came to camp around noon. I want to say something about what it looks like. Riding into your own camp with a white woman at your back. In that part of Wyoming, in that year. It looks like whatever people have already decided it looks like. I had 41 people, and they were mine, and I was theirs, and I was not worried about what my people thought. What they thought was, "Chaitan did a thing. It must have been the right thing to do. Now let's help." Shh. That's the arrangement between a chief and his people when it's working right. What I was thinking about was the outside. Was Decker. Was the sheriff in Garner's Crossing, a man named Purcell, who had never gone looking for trouble, but who would come when trouble was brought to him, and who had no great warmth for my band but no particular enmity either. He was a man of the law, which meant he was a man of the facts, and the fact was that Nessa had walked to me. Still, I'd been in the territory long enough to know that facts and what happens to facts when they go through the hands of men are two different things. Swiftbird came out to meet us. He looked at Nessa. He looked at me. He said nothing, just turned and walked back toward his fire, which meant, all right, let's see how this goes. My daughter, Winona, came running from somewhere and stopped, 10 feet short, when she saw the woman and looked at me with a look that was half question and half pure 7-year-old assessment. She was small and dark-haired and had her mother's eyes, and she was at that moment, as at most moments, the most important thing in my life, I said. This is Nessa. She's going to stay with us a while. Winona looked at Nessa. She said, do you like horses? Nessa said, more than almost anything. Winona said, good, then come and see mine. And she took Nessa's hand like that was the end of the question and led her off toward the remuda. And I watched them go, and something settled in me that I didn't have a word for, like a door closing quietly, not the slamming kind, the settling kind. She stayed. Not because I asked her. I want to be clear about that. I'd told her about the boarding house in Laramie, and I'd said the offer was real and would stay real, and she could take it any time. I told her that again the second morning and the third. The third time she said, Chayton, I know. Stop telling me. She stayed because she chose to. She was useful. I say that plainly because she would want it said plainly. She wasn't the kind of woman who wanted to be described around the edges. She could stitch wounds. She'd learned it from her husband's mother, who'd been a midwife. She could set a broken bone if it wasn't too complicated. 2 days after she arrived, one of my men, a young man named Lamy Elk, came back from hunting with 2 cracked ribs from a bad fall, and she looked at him and said, I can wrap those if you'll let me, and he let her, and she wrapped them well. He could breathe without wincing by the following morning. She learned words, my language. She was deliberate about it. Not performing, not charming people, just learning because she wanted to speak to people correctly, and she understood that speaking to someone in their language is a form of respect. By the 3rd week, she could ask the Rikis questions and understand most of the answers. Winona taught her. Winona, who had been a quiet child since her mother died, became a different child around Nessa, talkative, instructional, deeply pleased with herself for being a teacher. I watched them in the evenings and felt a thing that I'd thought was done with me. Decker came on the 14th day. He came with the reddish-bearded man, and a third man I hadn't seen before. And he came in the middle of the afternoon, when the light is flat, and you can see everything clearly. And there's no question about what's there. He came to the edge of our camp, and he called out for me. I came out. He had a paper. He said Purcell had drawn it up. He said it was a writ for the return of Nessa Phelps, who had been willfully removed from a lawful arrangement. I said, was it a lawful arrangement? Under what law? He didn't have an answer for that. The paper was his answer, which meant he was hiding behind it, meant he knew the answer was no. I said, she walked to me. 2 witnesses. He said nothing. I said, and she's here by her own choice. I can demonstrate by calling her. He said, do that. So I called her. She came out of the camp. She stood beside me. She looked at Decker. She said, I'm not going with you. She said it the way she'd said it to me in the shelter when she'd told me to stop offering Laramie. Clear, final. Decker looked at her. He looked at me. He said, this isn't over, I said. It is. Go back to Purcell and tell him what you saw. She's here. She's well. She's here because she chose to be. If Purcell wants to come out here and speak with her himself, he's welcome to come. You 3 don't come back to this camp uninvited. He sat on his horse for a moment. He wanted to push. I could see him wanting to push. I was standing in front of 41 people, not alone on a ridge, and he was 3. And the math was doing its work on him. They left. I watched them go. Nessa stood beside me and we watched them go, and when they were over the hill she let out a breath. A long, slow breath, she said. "You think they'll come back?" I said. "Decker might try something. His pride won't let him not. But Purcell is a different animal. Purcell will come, ask you directly. You'll answer directly and he'll close the matter." She said. "You trust a white sheriff?" I said. "Trust that he's a man of the facts. Which is as much as you can trust most people." She looked at me sideways. She said, "That's a careful way to live," I said. "It's kept me alive." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I think it's kept you more than alive." I didn't know what she meant by that, not exactly. Not right then. I thought about it later. Purcell came 3 days after that. Alone. No deputies, which was his way of saying this was a conversation, not an enforcement. He was a straight-backed man, around 50, with a weathered face and eyes that didn't waste movement. He spoke to Nessa for half an hour, just the two of them, while I sat by my fire and cleaned my rifle and didn't listen, which was the correct thing to do. When they were done, he came and sat across from me. He said, "She says she's here of her own free will." I said, "She is," he said. "You know what people in town are saying?" I said. "I can guess," he said. "I'm going to say this once and not repeat it. I don't much care what people say. I care what the law says. The law says she's a grown woman of sound mind who can decide where she lives. She's decided." He looked at me. "You're going to have trouble because of this, Chayton. Not from me. From other directions," I said. "I know," he said. "Then." He stood up. He looked around the camp, at the fire, at Winona who was watching him from a careful distance, at the horses, at the careful order of things. He nodded once, to himself. Then he got on his horse and rode back south. The trouble came 3 weeks later. I said it would. Decker came back in the night. Not him and 2 men, him and 9. I knew they were coming before they got there. 2 of my men who'd been out overnight came back at dusk and said they'd seen fires south and west of us. Men camped and drinking. That's the sign. Men who come at night and drink while they wait are men who've worked themselves up to something. They're nervous. Nervous men drink. I had the camp ready. I want to say that plainly too, without making it more than it was. I had 41 people and 30 years of knowing this land. 9 drunk nervous men from the south were not the hardest thing I'd ever arranged against. Nessa came to me when I was checking on the horses at the far end of the remuda. It was full dark by then, she said. "I'm the one they want. Tell me what to do." I said, "Nothing. You stay in camp and you keep Winona with you." She said, "Chayton." I looked at her. She said, "This is because of me. These men came here because of me." "If there's a fight and someone gets hurt," I said. "If there's a fight and someone gets hurt, it'll be because 9 men rode in the dark to take a woman who chose where she was. That's not on you." She was looking at me. The way she looked at me sometimes. Not the deciding look, not the sideways look, but the straight one. The one that didn't have any calculation in it. She said, "You took a rope burn for me. On a morning you didn't have to be there," I said. "It healed," she said, quiet. "I know. I'm saying I remember it." I put my hand on the neck of the closest horse for something to do with it. She reached out and put her hand on top of mine. Just for a second. Just the weight of her hand on the back of mine. Then she said, "Go do what you have to do." The fire was mine. I should explain that. When men come at night to do harm to what's yours, one answer is to wait in the dark for them. Another answer is to be the darkness. I chose the second. I sent Lakota and 2 others in a wide circle south to come at their camp from behind. I went with 2 men from the west. Swiftbird stayed with the others in the main camp, with the women and the children and Winona and Nessa. We came on Decker's camp from 2 sides. 3. They had a fire and 9 horses, and they had been drinking since sundown, and they were loud in the way of men who are telling each other they're not afraid. I walked into the light of their fire, alone. My 2 men were in the dark behind me, and Lakota was behind them in the dark behind them, and Decker and his 9 did not know that. What they saw was one man walking into firelight. Decker stood up. I said, "This ends here. Go home," he said. "You're one man." I said, "I'm not." From the dark behind me, my 2 men showed their positions. From the dark behind Decker, Lakota showed his. 9 men sitting around a fire with rifles at 3 compass points. Decker looked at the dark. He looked at me. I said, "I have been patient, because patience is what my people needed me to be. My patience has a shape. You found the edge of it tonight. I won't say this again. Go home, all of you, and don't come back toward my camp or toward that woman with anything but empty hands." There was a long silence. The fire crackled. One of Decker's men, not Decker, stood up slowly and reached for his horse's reins. That was the first one. The rest followed, one by one, the way men follow when someone else has the courage to go first. Decker was the last. He stood at the fire looking at me for a long time. I let him look. "I was in no hurry," he said, finally. "You're going to pay for this someday," I said. "Most debts come due eventually. I'll pay mine when they do." He got on his horse. He rode south. Stood at the edge of the dead fire until I was sure they were gone. Then I went home. When I came back into camp, Nessa was awake. Most people were. Swiftbird was standing by the main fire, upright, smoking, and he looked at me as I came through and nodded once, very small, which was his version of the loudest kind of praise. Winona was asleep against Nessa's side. Nessa had her arm around Winona and her back against a post of the shelter, and she was awake. She'd been waiting. When she saw me, she closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. I sat down near them. "Not touching, just near," she said, very quietly so she wouldn't wake Winona. "Are you hurt?" I said, "No." She said, "Did they go?" I said, "They went." She let out a breath. Then she looked at me in that straight way and she said, "You did that for us," I said. "I did what was necessary." She said, "Chayton, that's not the same thing and you know it." I looked at her. Winona stirred against her side and resettled, and Ness adjusted her arm automatically, without looking, the way a person holds something they've already gotten used to holding. I said, "I know." She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "The morning you came down off that ridge, I heard you before I saw you." I was holding the box and I heard hooves and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that it was someone making it worse. She paused. Then, "You put your horse between me and him." She stopped again, looking at the fire. That was the first time since my father died that I felt. She searched for it. Certain. That word. Like the ground was solid. I said nothing. "I let it sit," she said. "I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have Laramie, you told me that. I want to stay because I want to be here. Because Winona is teaching me to speak properly and your people have been decent to me. And because," she looked at me, "because when I'm with you I know the ground is solid." I looked at the fire, my daughter sleeping, the camp quiet around us. I said, "This is a hard life. I'll say that plainly," she said. "I've had soft lives. They weren't better," I said. "People will have things to say," she said. "People had things to say when I married a poor man instead of a richer one. They had things to say when my father died and left nothing." She looked at me. "Their mouths keep moving." I stopped listening. I said, "Then stay," she said. "Yes." It didn't get simple after that. I want to say that too, because this is a true account, and not a story that ties off at the end. Decker caused trouble for another 6 months. Purcell dealt with most of it. The valley's white settlers had their opinions, and the opinions ranged from hostile to carefully indifferent to, a few of them, a few. Something closer to respect, which I hadn't expected from that quarter. There was a woman, a rancher's wife, named Glennis Hartley, who came to our camp in November with a bolt of wool fabric and a ham and said, matter-of-factly, that she thought what I'd done for Nessa was the kind of thing more men should do, and fewer did, and she'd brought the fabric for the girl because the cold was coming, and she looked to be one blanket shy of enough. She said all of this at my fire and ate the food my people offered her and left without requiring anything from anyone. That was the valley shifting. Not overnight. Over months. But shifting. Nessa learned more of the language. She learned to read the land the way we read it. Not the white way, not the scientific way, but the way that says, this grass is grazed by elk. That means water in that direction. That sky means change by nightfall. She had a quickness for it. She stopped carrying the tin box everywhere and started leaving it in the shelter, which I understood to mean she was home, enough not to need to carry it. She and Winona were a thing together by mid-autumn. Winona called her something that translated roughly as woman who knows horses, which was a child's name and an honest one. Nessa learned to say it back and used it when Winona was being difficult, which made Winona laugh, every time, which was the point. The cold came hard that year. January was cruel. There was a stretch of 10 days where we didn't go far from the main fire, and the horses stood, bunched in the windbreak, and everybody ate less than was comfortable. I won't dress that up. It was hard. It is always hard. And you know it will be hard and you prepare. And then it is hard anyway. One night in the middle of that stretch, I came in from checking the horses. Late, very cold, and Nessa was up. She'd kept a coal alive in the small fire of our shelter. She'd had food ready, which she'd held back warm, not much, but hot. She handed it to me without fanfare. The way a person does something they've decided to do, because it's right. Not because they want credit for it. I ate. She sat beside me, she said, "Swiftbird told me something today." I said, "Swiftbird talks too much," she said with a small smile. "He told me, you haven't taken anything for yourself since your wife died. That you give to the camp first, always, and take what's left." He said, "You've been hungry more winters than not," I said. "That's a chief's job," she says. "I know." She looked at the fire. "I'm saying I see it." Those 3 words. I'm saying I see it. I didn't know how much weight those words had been carrying by being unsaid until she said them. I said nothing. I ate what she'd kept warm for me. The coal she'd tended threw a small orange glow on the walls. After a while she put her head against my shoulder. Just that. The weight of it. The simple physical fact of it, I said, eventually. Winona's going to be impossible if she finds out. I sat here, letting her teacher use me as a pillow. Nessa made a sound that was a laugh, quiet, so she wouldn't wake anyone, she said. She already knows. She told me to do it, I said. She's 7 years old. She said, she's an old soul. Couldn't argue with that. In the spring, Swiftbird performed a ceremony. It was not a white ceremony, and it was not a church. And Purcell had no papers for it. I didn't need papers. What I needed was what happened. The old man speaking the old words over a fire in the old way, and Nessa standing beside me, and 41 people witnessing. She wore a dress that Glennis Hartley had brought out from town. Blue wool, not fancy, right? She wore her hair the way she always wore it. And she held the tin box, which she'd brought from the shelter, and held not out of fear. I understood, because the people in it deserved to see. Swiftbird said the words. He said them in my language. And Nessa understood most of them by then. The ones she didn't, she'd ask me later, and I told her. He was asking the ones who'd gone before us to look on what we were building and find it. She said, "Do you think they did?" I said, "I think your father would have." She looked at the fire. She said quietly, "Yes, I think so too." That was the year I turned 39. The year Nessa turned 21. The year Winona decided she was going to become the best rider in the territory, which she is well on her way to being, and which I encourage because there are worse things to be. The year Decker left the valley for good. I heard he went to Colorado. Nothing since, and I don't look for news of him. I think about that morning sometimes. The rope, the burn, Decker's eyes, and the way Nessa walked past him, like he was a post in the ground. The sound of my horse's hooves on the soft morning ground. I think about the tin box and what it told me before I knew the story of it. That she was a person who kept things, didn't let go of what mattered. That's the same person she is now, in this life, at this fire. She keeps what matters, and she doesn't let go of it. And what she decided to keep and not let go of was this, was me. A man doesn't always know what he's worth. I'll say that plainly. You can work hard and do right and stand up when it's needed and still have mornings where you wonder if it amounted to anything, if any of it left a mark that mattered. If you were seen, really seen, by anyone who counted, she saw me. From the first time I fixed that wagon wheel and didn't take the credit for it, she was already looking, already deciding. I am not a man who uses the word blessed. It's not my word, doesn't come from my tradition. But there is something that comes close to it. My language doesn't translate cleanly. It means something like, the world put the right weight in your hands. That what you were given to carry turned out to be the right thing, and you were strong enough for it. And in carrying it, you found out you were more than you thought you were. That's what I have. That tin box on the shelf in our shelter. Winona's laugh from outside the door. Nessa's hand on the back of mine, the weight of it still there. The ground is solid. That's enough. That's everything.